Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming to the Dali Museum this morning. We are overwhelmed by your enthusiasm. Hopefully, this talk will be worth coming out this morning on a beautiful day, but certainly the exhibition we have upstairs is very exciting, as many of you know. For those of you, there we go, a little better. For those of you who haven't seen the show yet, that's not better. We'll try that. I guess I can adjust the volume, right? Yep. Let's do that. And right there. Perfect. Okay, there we go. The show is very special, and of course we are here this morning for our for our coffee with the curator. This is what we do on the first Wednesday of every month, and next month our director, Hank Hine, is going to be talking also about the Disney exhibition. A lot of the show is because of his enthusiasm for the exhibition. He worked on it for the past 2 years with the curator in San Francisco. So he will be shedding a very different perspective on it. Also, we want to thank Cafe Gala, who provides the refreshments for this morning. A lot of people drinking coffee, so we are in their debt. And also, just in case you're not aware of it, on Saturday afternoons at 1 o'clock, we have a free film series. So every week we show a free film. For the Disney and Dali exhibition, we're going to be showing lots of films related to either Walt Disney Studios or Salvador Dali topics that relate to the show. And I believe this Saturday we're showing Alice in Wonderland. So if you haven't seen that in a while, that's something definitely to come for. We'll be showing it in the theater next door. But we are here for a talk about the show upstairs, and what I've decided to do is give you some information that definitely relates to the way we have the show laid out, but also I'm going to do a bit more of an extended reading of the movie Destino, which is featured in the film. And there's some lovely music in the background that will probably be with us for a bit. The first question, of course, the question that comes to everybody's mind is Disney, Dali. You know, how is there a show bringing these two people together? What could they possibly have in common? Well, I think we've somehow lost the image. Not really sure what just happened. Okay. Good deal. Okay. So when we think of Walt Disney, of course, we think of Mickey Mouse, and we think of Donald Duck, and we think of Pluto, and just a variety of characters. He changed the world that we grew up in as children. Salvador Dali, of course, created the world of melting watches, despondent dream imagery, the world that we adapted to in college, more or less. That might be the best way to contrast them. When you talk about their worldviews, they could not be more polar opposites. Of course, on the one side we have Bambi. We have a kind of wholesomeness, a sort of frosting on every cake and silver linings on every cloud. That's the Disney view of the world, a world that's always friendly, always safe. Bad things happen, but ultimately good things come out of it. Princesses meet Prince Charmings, everybody lives happily ever after. With Dali, perhaps not so much, We have despondent, horrifying nightmares that just erupt into our daily world. This particular image of Spain ripping itself apart is very potent and very much the world that we associate with Dali. So how do these views possibly come together? Because we know not only did they collaborate, but there was a friendship that was sparked by their relationship. And that's what is explored in the exhibition upstairs. I just wanted to show you, before we go too much further, two very different views by other artists that bring together Dali and Disney. This was one that I found online. This is the editor of Road and Track magazine. It's an image he came up with that is very friendly indeed. It's a very Disney-esque approach to the friendship. This is, of course, Mickey holding the melting watch. It's exactly what we expect from one perspective. On the other hand, we have this other artist, Todd Shore, who is a very pop imagist, and he created the image of Walt and Salvador coming together as the two turtles in the movie Destino. Very horrific and very nightmarish indeed, very much in keeping with the Dali perspective on this meeting. So a lot of give and take back and forth. So the two people we're talking about are not only millennial artists, they are figures who were born very close to the 1900, Disney in 1901, Dali in 1904. They were the 20th century. And because of their ambition, their innovation, and their kind of maverick nature, they really changed and marked the 20th century in very, very distinct ways that overlap, as you'll see, quite often. The exhibition that we have is a collaboration. It was started by the San Francisco Walt Disney Family Museum, and it was Disney's daughter, Diane Disney Miller, who was responsible for starting the show out there. And they wanted to do an exhibition because she remembered meeting Salvador Dali when she was 12 years old, and what a remarkable meeting that was, and how fond she was of that meeting. So she wanted to do this show, and she hired a gentleman named Ted Nicolau. And Ted Nicolau is the curator of the exhibition for San Francisco, and we collaborated with him when the show came here. As I said, our director had been working with him for probably the last 2 years when we said, not only do we want to participate in the show, but we would really like to be collaborators. We would like to bring the show here. And so Ted's the one who shaped the exhibition. He wrote the catalog that we have for sale. He wrote the audio guide, which Sigourney Weaver presents. And he directed a very good documentary, an excellent documentary called Dali and Disney, A Date with Destino, which came out in 2010. We're going to be showing it several times during the course of the exhibition. So definitely you'll want to take advantage of that and see it. And let's talk a little bit about the show. The first area of the show is in many ways what we have added to the exhibition. The very beginning and the very ending are a little bit different than what they presented in San Francisco. And I think in many ways take the show from being about friendship to being really about what we all experience as Disney and Dali. And that's because both Walt Disney and Salvador Dali, who live in the visual arts world, the world of animation, the world of fine art, found themselves uncomfortable with just leaving their worlds in that two-dimensional reality. They had to keep projecting their dreams, their fantasies, their imagination into a three-dimensional environment for us to share their dreams. And so that's really what the first part of our exhibition is about. It's about this idea that Walt Disney did not only create very, very memorable, life-changing movies, he also created environments that we occupy and we go to, and we spend a lot of money every time we go there. Sleeping Beauty's Castle in Anaheim, California, and of course, the Cinderella Castle over in Orlando are places that occupy our imagination. When you think of the most fabulous place on earth, many times this is what comes to mind. What we have in our exhibition are the blueprints for Sleeping Beauty's Castle, and the reason is because we wanted to capture that idea that this is something that needs to be created. This is something that's a three-dimensional environment that is manufactured from dreams to reality. There's this independent step that happens. And so we've been able to, create this incredible billboard-size version of this blueprint, so you can actually see how Disney engineers and architects had to think and create and design what we now consider to be, this iconic experience, this visual environment for us to live in. And here, of course, in the early 1950s, it's Walt Disney talking about his plans for Disneyland, that he needed to make this environment something that we could step into and experience physically to, again, turn our dreams into a reality. Very similar, and a little bit earlier, in 1939, Salvador Dali was given the opportunity to create a funhouse environment at the New York World's Fair. And some of you are very familiar with this. Others of you may have never heard of this, but it was called the Dream of Venus. And essentially it was a pavilion where you were to be invited into the dreams that Venus was dreaming. You were to basically be witnessing the dreams of what she was imagining. So already Dali has created a physical environment, an architectural space for dreams, like a pavilion of dreams. And it is a pretty damn ugly place. It is totally and completely one of the least attractive buildings that you can ever encounter. It was very deliberate. Dali was very aware that the 1939 World's Fair was the world of tomorrow. It was basically a model for Tomorrowland that Disney World has. Everything was streamlined. It was very modern, very beautiful. Dali wanted to have the eruption of the irrational in that modern environment. And so he created this pavilion, which is basically like a coral grotto. And you can see there's all kinds of different things that have been fixed to it. There's a Botticelli Venus. There's a reference to Michelangelo's Venus Virgin on the Rocks. There are other kinds of mermaid shapes. And basically you pass through, right over here, you pass through the ticket booth, that fish, which is the ticket booth, through the woman's legs that have been spread, and basically that's how you get to the dream. I should also mention that the New York World's Fair actually had an area that was an adults-only area, which is pretty surprising. There was a lot of topless entertainment, which also comes as a surprise. This was one of the topless entertainment pavilions. This was a mermaid show. And you would go inside, and shows you some of the photographs of Dali working on this. On the left-hand side, we have Dali painting one of the backdrops for one of those mermaid aquariums. Dali and Gala hanging out of the fish, which we have recreated upstairs. And then Dali with one of the, more or less posing with one of the designs over on the far right. This is one of our topless figures. This is actually Venus herself. And as you would walk into the pavilion, there is a person above the bed. There's a very, very large red bed, and there's a person right above here who's basically shushing us. And what she's trying to say is that enter very quietly because you don't want to disturb the dreaming Venus. You're about to view the dreams of Venus, who's here asleep on this bed, and that's what you're about to witness. And essentially, Dali created a number of dioramas in addition to the mermaid aquariums, but this is one of the two aquariums, and here you can see the woman swimming past this large, it's underwater, of course, a large piano that's been placed underwater, and there's a rubber woman. It looks very real, but it's actually made of rubber, and she's become the piano keys. So very dreamlike, very much the eruption of the irrational. There's bones off to the side, there's strange relics. And for those of you who have not seen the show yet, we've actually been able to turn this image into a 12-foot long lenticular 3D photograph. So it is super cool, it is pretty wonderful, and again, something very unique to our presentation of the show. The last area when we're talking about architecture of the imagination deals with these very wondrous structures, Spaceship Earth and the geodesic dome on Dali's own museum in Spain. If you have not been to Dali's museum, it was opened in 1974 in the very space where he had his first exhibition when he was 14 years old. He is actually buried under the geodesic structure, which was probably not the original intent, but even more iconically, he is. And when Dali created his museum, he again wanted to create something like the Dream of Venus. It's a funhouse environment. It doesn't feel like any museum you've ever been to. And I say that for better or worse. Some people really love it, some people can't stand it, but once you go, there is no place else like it. And the geodesic structure was for him the crowning achievement, the crown that he's placed on top of his museum. Whenever you're driving around Spain, it's the icon on the signs that lead you to that area where Dali's museum is. Similarly, in 1982, Epcot opened, and Spaceship Earth, the geodesic structure, is really the signature of Epcot. And Epcot was always part of Walt Disney's dreams in the 1960s. He never got to see it come to fruition, but it was always an important part of the ideas behind it, and the same sort of geodesic sphere becomes, in a way, the symbol for the possibility of man through architecture, a kind of utopian perspective. So they rhyme really well back and forth together. And what's interesting is I think both of these go back to 1939. The New York World's Fair, where Dali had his pavilion, the symbol for it was the trilon, which is the large obelisk, and the perisphere, which is this large round structure. It looks very much like, what's the movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still? It definitely has that kind of vibe to it. It's very sci-fi. And when you look at Spaceship Earth next to the perisphere, they very much ring together the same way. They have that sort of epic, iconic quality to them. And of course, with Dali, there's no doubt about his influence of the trilon and the perisphere. This is a catalog for an exhibition at the Julian Levy Gallery, where Dali has, of course, turned them into Dalinian characters who are basically at war with one another, tearing each other apart. And then we're going to go, just very quickly, I'm going to cover a couple of the themes in the exhibition and then spend some time on Destino, which is the movie that Dali created in collaboration with Disney Studios. So just to mention it very quickly, their early years, both Walt and Salvador were born very close to 1900. Walt was born in December of 1901, Salvador in May of 1904, about 2.5-year difference between the two of them, very much raised as part of this new century, and essentially through their ambitions capturing and transforming what we think of the century. One parallel that's worth noting is that both of them had very difficult fathers. Many of us are familiar with the story of Salvador Dali and his father, who were constantly kind of the classic Oedipal struggle between a very demanding, domineering father who was very encouraging of his son while at the same time being very short-tempered, leading to constant friction between the two of them. So a real volatile kind of relationship throughout Dali's entire life, but going back to his childhood. Disney, slightly different, had a father who didn't care, had a father who had zero interest in his children, just probably would have been best without children, showed no love at all. And so the story goes basically that both of them, in a sense, found a refuge in art. They found an ability to be able to focus their energies, their lack of paternal happiness through their art and their creativity. So Walt Disney attended night school, trying to hone his craft. He was a very good caricature artist, was able to get early jobs and money from this. And of course, Salvador Dali had a talent that led him to go to the San Fernando Royal Academy, which was where you would go in Spain if you couldn't go to the Beaux-Arts. So a much more traditional education in art. And it's also worth mentioning at this point that when we're talking about them, we're more or less presenting them as equals. But it's really important to remember that Salvador Dali was a fine artist. Disney was an empire creator. I mean, he owned artists. So it's kind of an uneven, equivocation between the two of them. But at the same time, they start from relatively similar inspirations. And talking about environment, one of the other really important details that comes out of this show is that both of them had a sort of nostalgic connection to their childhood environments that haunted them and stayed with them the rest of their lives and led to a lot of the artwork that we associate with them. So with Walt Disney, it was Marceline, Missouri. He only spent 4 years there, but for him, these 4 years were the most idyllic moments in his entire childhood. And he always went back to it in his imagination. When he talked about homespun values, it was always Marceline, Missouri that became the environment for that. And of course, as time moves on, Marceline becomes the model for Main Street, USA, on the right-hand side. Walt Disney, an obsessive about steam engines, creates a small-scale version of what he called the Carrollwood Pacific Railroad, which he built on his own house property in California. This is Disney driving the Lily Bell, which was the engine of the Carrollwood Pacific. And down below, of course, the train that takes us around Disneyland and Disney World were modeled on that same train that Disney remembered at the train station at Marceline, Missouri. So for him, this kind of childhood moment becomes the perfection that he's constantly going back to until he actually creates an environment which allows him to recreate these experiences. And one detail that I'm sure everybody knows, but in Anaheim, California, Disney had an actual apartment at one of the buildings on Main Street. So he was able to actually live there, go out, mix amongst the people, see how people were enjoying, his creation. So he was very much, this was not a passing fancy. This was the world that he created for himself and for others. For Salvador Dali, similarly, the landscape of his childhood becomes the landscape of his imagination, stays with him throughout his life. So here we have Dali, 22 years old, sitting on the Bay of Cadaqués. On the right-hand side, we have one of those amazing rocks from Cap de Creus. And in his paintings, they're everywhere, from the beginning to the very end. Dali is constantly drawn back to this environment, recreating the rocks of his landscape of the Costa Brava and the Catalan region. And it's where he, again, draws this kind of dreamlike inspiration, looking at these rocks as if they're clouds that have faces and ideas behind them. Moving really quickly in the next section, the main idea here is that both Walt Disney and Salvador Dali were people of their times because they embraced both the idea of the machine and the idea of the unconscious. Certainly Salvador Dali becomes the artist of the unconscious through his relationship with Surrealism, and Walt Disney becomes the king of an empire through his understanding, knowledge, and awareness of what technology can do to revolutionize an industry. And there's a great photo here of both of them by cameras. With Walt Disney, of course, he had a number of early failures until finally he moves to the studio, which is Hyperion Studios. And that's really where Disney starts to found his business. And they really do start to revolutionize very quickly what's expected from animation. He starts doing live animation, or live people interacting with animated figures. That revolutionizes the industry. And eventually, by the end of the decade, by the end of the 1930s, he creates this incredible invention, which is called the multiplane camera, which allows for movies like Snow White. It allows for an incredible depth of field that creates much more of a cinematic experience. Animation was always a flat, two-dimensional space that seemed to be always contained in one room. He created an environment where you could go from something very close, trees in the foreground, all the way to mountains in the background, and then to the figure that was in those mountains. So it just really revolutionized everything, and it was because of his belief in technology, and as a result, changed the industry. With Salvador Dali, of course, he enters into surrealism not necessarily through his paintings, which are pretty remarkable and astonishing, but through a movie. And it's the movie he creates with his good friend Luis Buñuel. Buñuel was agricultural student who was interested in film and literature, winds up working in Paris for a little bit with film Fall of the House of Usher, comes back, he and Dali decide to make a movie, and the movie revolutionizes the way cinema is thought of. And of course, it's called The Andalusian Dog, and opens with the slicing of a woman's eyeball with a razor blade. And from there, it's just fun for the next 17 minutes. It's, they are masters of knowing how to use a pun to create both a creepy resonance and also something that's very, unforgettable. Donkey stuffed into pianos is something that's very unforgettable. And the movie just moves on like this, but it was because of the importance of that movie and the power of that movie that Dali was invited to join the Surrealist group. We move into the next area, which I'm skipping a few parts, but they finally become really international figures in the mid-1930s. 1936, Salvador Dali winds up on the cover of Time magazine in December. The following year, December of 1937, Walt Disney winds up on the cover of Time magazine. It really is the moment when both of them become international celebrities. They are suddenly kings of empires. They are the ones who are recognized by all. Dali is surrealism for the general public. Walt Disney is animation for the general public. Their ambitions are just incredibly uncontainable, and they're celebrated through in this moment. They also have a very important distinction, which probably Disney was aware of, and certainly Dali would have been aware of. In 1936, both of them were featured in the Fantasticar Dada and Surrealism show, which was at the Museum of Modern Art. Salvador Dali was represented, I believe, by 17 paintings. We own a few of them here, which of course are in the exhibition, but also Illumined Pleasures and Persistence in Memory were included in the exhibition. So for Salvador Dali, he had really arrived and created these iconic images that captured the Freudian psychology of the 20th century. Walt Disney was featured with two cells that related to this film that's playing upstairs. We've got a snippet of it called, it's actually called The Three Little Wolves, but the segment is The Wolf Pacifier, which is perhaps the most violent thing I've ever seen related to Disney Studios. This wolf, who perhaps deservingly is basically butchered and torn apart through this machine that's very inventive. And so that is the moment when both of them are presented together to a public as part of a larger movement, but it's that idea of fantasy and the imagination are what brings them together. 1937, Dali finally travels to Hollywood, and he says that he writes a letter to André Breton, the leader of the Surrealists. He says, "I'm in Hollywood, where I've made contact with the three American Surrealists, Harpo Marx, Walt Disney, and Cecil B. DeMille." He says, "I believe I've intoxicated them suitably and hope that the possibilities for surrealism here will become a reality." That's probably a lie. He certainly had met Harpo Marx. Absolutely, positively, that did happen in 1937. He probably did not meet Cecil B. DeMille. It's at least not documented. And he certainly had not met Walt Disney at this point. But in his imagination, they were the three figures associated with Hollywood that were closest to his ideas of surrealism. And you could make lots of, there are lots of reasons why potentially these would be the three he chose. Cecil B. DeMille, probably not everybody's thought of surrealism in America, but for Dali it was true. And for him, I think it was Disney's imagination, the sheer inventiveness on the screen that really captivated him. The silly symphonies were something that Dali cherished, and so he was very primed to meeting Disney. But it would still wait a few more years. So very end of that decade, 1939, Disney grows. They build their Burbank studios, which is, again, another moment of revolutionizing the industry. And he starts taking art very seriously. He had gone to Europe. He started to look at a lot of art in museums. He started to hire artists from a European tradition, and he put the greatest value on the quality of his animators. He felt that an animation studio is only as good as the capability of the animators themselves. And so not only did he hire the best that he could find, he also started to invite artists to come and give classes at the Institute in Burbank. And he would even have drawing classes. Like here, this is a gentleman with a horse. They're trying to all draw the horse in real time to get the accuracy of what they're seeing so that they can get a real feel for what it is they're trying to, share with the general public. And of course, this leads to some incredible moments. The moments that are sort of the prelude to Dali entering the scene. These are a couple stills from Night on Bald Mountain, perhaps the most unforgettable segment of Fantasia. It's the very last one. Absolutely amazing, way over the top, and very un-Disney-esque. There's even nudity included in this film, along with lots of dead bodies and horrifying visions. So it's very much a European artist kind of vision. It's not what you would normally associate with Disney, but it was a Disney production. Also, slightly different, but probably even more memorable for those who grew up with it, was the movie Dumbo. When he suddenly becomes intoxicated, Pink Elephants on Parade is just this absolutely, totally mind-blowing, technicolor, surreal experience that is done by Disney artists. So they are very open to this kind of imagination that Surrealism was exploring already, but just on a much more limited dose. But before they meet, of course, the war breaks out. And so there's a small segment of the exhibition dealing with war. Salvador Dali, of course, forced to come to the United States in exile. And for 8 years, he remains here in the US as a refugee, basically. And this is also the Hollywood years for Dali, when he really transforms his work and works in a very different way, which is the next part of the story. Disney, of course, realized that the US government was annexing businesses and starting to more or less take them over in order for the war effort in the Pacific. And he decides that rather than just walk away, let's turn Disney Studios into the US government studios for making films for the soldiers overseas. And so there's lots and lots of footage related to this. Most of it kept under wraps by Disney Studios. Of course, during wartime, you don't present the enemy in the kindest way, and so there's a lot of perhaps overstated caricatures and generalizations that Disney Studios would perhaps like us to forget, but they were very much a part of the war effort. All of their artists were able to stay involved. They may not have been making money, but they weren't closing their doors. And so it was a very pragmatic decision that allowed Disney Studios to continue through the wars. But this coincides with the period of time of Hollywood. First thing to be said is that Walt Disney and Salvador Dali were on the same page with the Marx Brothers. The Marx Brothers absolutely changed the world. Their brand of humor was so unique and so fast and so completely insane that it was very much a kind of surreal experience in Hollywood. Dali is absolutely on the mark with describing them that way. But in addition, Walt Disney loved the Marx Brothers, and Disney Studios actually used them as characters in several of their shorts. And we do have one of the cells upstairs that shows that. So in terms of their appreciation of humor, Disney and Dali were on the same page. Dali also threw one of the parties of the decade, basically. He created a large surrealist party, a surrealist environment at Pebble Beach, California, at the Del Monte Lodge. Celebrities were there like Bob Hope and Gloria Vanderbilt and a number of other key figures. There's some great footage upstairs of the party. This is Gala on the left-hand side, dressed as the princess. She was actually asleep on the bed, which was also the table where all the food was. So the table is the bed. Dali has this kind of anatomical drawings that is attached to himself. And there was a ballet, a ballet of the wrecked car, where there was a wrecked car damaged and off to the side. These were the two victims of the accident engaged in the ball. So it was decadent, it was very dark, it was very confusing. They hired lots of animals from the local zoo to be part of it, so there were monkeys and lions there. Everybody dressed up, and it was the ball to be remembered. So Dali was responsible for it. It was sort of his introduction to the Hollywood celebrity machine. At the same time, Dali was definitely involved in ballet. This is one of the ballet backdrops from New York City. You can see Dali's sentimental colloquy from our collection with the bicycle riders and how that's echoed in the actual performance with the bicycle riders with the large rocks on their head. And 1945, Dali's hired by Alfred Hitchcock to create the dream sequence for a movie called Spellbound, which was the first movie murder mystery where psychology and psychoanalysis was responsible for basically unraveling the killer. And so for Alfred Hitchcock, he wanted someone who would have the vision of what that dream would need to be that would be so essential to the movie, and nobody was better than Salvador Dali. So he hires Dali. He says, Dali was the best man for me to do the dreams. Dali knew that dreams were not fuzzy, but they were hard-edged, very crisp, very clean. And this particular sequence that deals with the eyeball curtain very much rhymes with the idea of the slit eyeball that we saw a few minutes earlier in Un Chien Andalou. Which brings us to Destino. And I'm going to just spend a few minutes talking about it. I've got lots and lots of stills because I think probably everybody in this room has seen that movie, some of us many, many times. It's only 7 minutes long, but there's a lot to pack into those 7 minutes. And I started realizing as I was looking at the show and thinking about this, there's a lot of subtlety that just is completely missed. You know, when you try to remember what happened in the movie, there's a girl who dances, there's a baseball player, there's some creepy ants that come out of the guy's hand, and it's like the rest of it's sort of a blur. So I thought it might be helpful to just go through section by section the sequence that Dali had actually very much anticipated early on and continued through the project almost to the end when it was finally abandoned. So the first thing to say, we still haven't talked about Dali and Disney meeting yet. They have not met yet. But Disney Studios was starting to invite a lot of artists to visit the studios. Thomas Hart Benton, Norman Rockwell, the composer Igor Stravinsky, and of course Leopold Stokowski, who's featured in Fantasia. They were all frequenters to the studio. So there was a very much an openness to great artists. And there was an interest, I'll put it that way, not a desire, but an interest from Walt Disney's part. Wouldn't it be interesting to have one of these great artists do something for us? It's also been pointed out, though, that Disney wanted to be the ruler in command. He did not want another genius on the studio, so to speak. So there was a little bit of tension, and that's probably why there are very few great artists who did work with Disney Studios. Nevertheless, he was visiting one of his animator's office. He had a book on surrealism which featured some work by Salvador Dali. Disney borrows it, becomes intrigued, eventually buys Dali's Secret Life autobiography, and he mails it to Salvador, knowing that he's staying in Pebble Beach, and says, would you mind signing my book? I'm very intrigued by it. I'm fascinated. Yours kindly, Walt Disney. Dali writes back and says, absolutely, please. He signs the book and he says, I'd be very open to a collaboration with you. Well, this was 1944. The following year, Dali is staying at Jack Warner's house, probably because he's doing a portrait of Mrs. Warner. But this is Jack Warner, Warner Brothers Studio Empire tycoon. And there's a party there, and that's where Dali is introduced to Walt Disney. They get on very well together. They talk about this possible collaboration, and Walt basically invites Salvador to come to the studios later that week. He does. They get talking about this project that possibly they could do. Walt Disney has, of course, secured the rights for lots of different music. They spent some time listening to songs. Dali gravitates towards this particular piece called Destino. And it seems it's not because of the music itself, but rather because of the title of it. Dali likes this idea of destiny. That's something that really resonates with him, and it's why he commits to the project. Disney's very intrigued, and he hires one of his trustworthy animators, a gentleman who's been with him since 1939 named John Hench. And John Hench was hired at the time of Fantasia, and he had done several more projects, including parts of Pinocchio, and he becomes really Dali's collaborator on this project. For at least 6 months and into the next year, John Hench is Dali's partner on this project. He also is one of the few animators that spoke some French. And Dali, being Catalan and Spanish, also spoke some French. And it should be very much emphasized, neither of them were fluent in French, but that's how they communicated. So a lot of the communication happened by similar ideas that they were able to show each other, but the conversation was rather limited. And just to tell you a little bit about Hench, for 65 years he worked for Disney. He worked until he died at the age of 95. He was he became one of Walt Disney's most important, collaborators. He was the one who created Tomorrowland. He was the one who oversaw the construction of Epcot. He created the Tower of Terror. These are all things that, we think of as being just part of the Disney enterprise, but it's really John Hench who was the trusted advisor who worked on these. And he, as I said, he became a senior vice president of Walt Disney Imagineering. And just a real brief aside, he actually joined us in 1994 on a trip to Spain. There was a large group from the museum, about 40 people. He and his wife were on the trip. Nobody had told us who they were, but over the course of the first few days, a few key figures who were on the trip, passed it around that, by the way, there's a gentleman here who worked with Dali. And so we were able to meet him, spend some time talking to him. Very, very gracious, very reserved, very elegant gentleman, but he did have some good stories. But we are going to immediately go right into the collaboration itself. There are 22 storyboard studies that we have upstairs. 5 of them are by John Hench, and the other 17 are by Dali. There was about 200 that they produced together over the course of the year. And what's remarkable is how similar they are in style. John Hench and Salvador Dali, over a course of a very short period of time, started to really resonate with each other's style. Dali found ways to adapt his work into a more Disney-esque kind of language, and John Hench was the person who would create the transitions from one Dali image to the next. So it's interesting, when you look at them upstairs, it is quite hard to tell which is by John and which is by Salvador. And the other real surprise for a lot of people is realizing that initially this was going to be a live action movie with animation. Dali, very much like Dick Van Dyke, was going to walk into an animated sequence and not dance, but really tell us about what surrealism is. So this was always the intent, is that Dali wanted this to be an opportunity to tell the world about what surrealism is through the art of animation. And it didn't quite develop that way. Dali, of course, known at this point for doing some of the most amazing images of the 20th century that combine metamorphosis, transformation, change back and forth between one form and another, lots of hidden images. This was his stock in trade, and he had really perfected it at the end of the 1930s. For example, the apparition of a face in a fruit dish, hundreds of images you can find in there the longer you look at it. Dali suddenly realized he had the opportunity to work with Disney animators and create this into a transitional animation where you could see the metamorphosis happen. And it deeply appealed to him, and he was very committed to it. He actually would check in almost every day around 8 to 8:30 in the morning. He would have lunch at the commissary with all the Disney animators, and he would leave somewhere between 5:30 and 7 every evening. He did this for about 3 months straight, and then continued working at Pebble Beach, and then John Hench would visit him there. So when we think of Dali, we think of kind of a slight diva, a difficult personality, someone who's very much incapable of being controlled. But for this period of time when he was working on this project, he was deeply committed to it. He wanted it to happen. And what you can see is that there's a lot of images from the show that resonate with previous iconic images that Dali had developed. There's ants that come out of hands, which is super creepy. There are bicycle riders with large blocks on their head. Actually, they're loaves of bread in the film, the final film, but they were supposed to be rocks. And here you can see one of the studies where this hand has all these bicycle riders going across it. There are telephones, like the lobster telephone. There's an entire almost Busby Berkeley kind of corridor where you see these telephones all the way down this tunnel. And there are, of course, eyeballs, lots of eyeballs. So when the young girl, the key figure in the movie, actually confronts them, it leads to a transition in the film. So instead of becoming Dali introducing us to the ideas of surrealism, very quickly it transforms into a love story. And Destino becomes a frustrated love story about this gentleman who is Kronos, representing time, the god of time, who is also a baseball player, of course, and the ballet dancer named Dalia, or Dalia, depending on how you pronounce it. So Dali gets to be in the movie through his surrogate female figure, which is kind of strange. But that's definitely her name, although you would never know it watching the movie. Disney originally described the story, which he found very intriguing, as a simple love story where a boy meets a girl. Very straightforward. Dali describes it as a magical exposition of the problems of life and the labyrinth of time. Not so simple. So somewhere between these two stories is what Destino was supposed to be. It's also worth mentioning at this point that one of the things that Walt Disney absolutely found fascinating and enjoyed about Dali was that his mind was constantly running. He constantly had great ideas. And one of the challenges for Disney Studios was that they had great animators who didn't always have great imaginations. You know, they were great at drawing what you told them to draw. They were not great at creating ambitious narratives. Not a problem with Dali. Dali had plenty of ideas to spare, and he was also very quick to change and respond the ideas that he had to feedback he got. So he was very malleable in this process, and so things started off really well. The storyboards, of which we have one of them featured upstairs, this is how Dali would approach the storyboard. Normally a storyboard is about 4 by 4, so this would be a typical storyboard. Dali always wanted to put two together so you could see more of the animation running from left to right. So it would start up here, go over to there, you go down, go this way, and you can really see how the animation transitions would happen here with that face, which is one of the most iconic images in the 2003 movie. And here we have two of the animation stills. Again, the girl, ballerina, Dalia, and the main character, Kronos, who is also the baseball player. So now I'm going to do more or less a close reading. It won't take very long, but I've got lots of images. And I've tried to do as many screenshots as I could from the film just to show you the 6 sections, because there are 6 sections in the development of it. And it really does go from a beginning, middle, to an end. And it's very close to what Dali and Hench just more or less explored back in 1946, finally completed in 2003. So the very first part is about the first encounter, the party, and the false destinies, the destinies that would lead Dalia astray. So the encounter begins in this big open landscape. We have the woman appear, and she walks up, and then suddenly you see her go to this large obelisk, which has this figure attached to it and a clock, and that's the figure of Kronos. So that's the first encounter between the two of them. She looks up at Kronos, and suddenly we see Kronos as a fountain, and then there's a transition where she is suddenly towering over the obelisk, and she pushes it into herself, into her heart. An opening appears, and the camera goes into that opening. And suddenly you have this very creepy nocturnal landscape. The moon is actually attached to spider legs walking across the background. There's a clock there that starts to run and ooze, and she has to run away from it. And then she encounters the man, Kronos himself, who just materializes in front of her. He seems to be somewhat electrified by her presence. She goes to kiss him, as you can see on the right-hand side. And I don't think you can see it, but on the bottom left, once she kisses him, he actually dissolves into this armor, this suit of armor that he has. He slides into it, and little moths come out of it. Freaks her out. She runs away, but immediately she turns out she's running on this tower. So we've got these two towers here. This is the large landscape of destiny. On the left-hand side, there's the Tower of Babel, where it's a female figure with this pathway along it, built on Hieronymus Bosch's or Peter Bruegel's Tower of Babel. On the right-hand side, we have a tower with the face of Jupiter, representing destiny, overseeing everything. And it begins where she's first apprehensive. There's a gentleman with a cocktail basically offered to her, champagne, and suddenly she's celebratory and she's having fun, she's laughing. There's dandelions in the air. She's dancing, there's music happening, and then there's the eyes of the others, the eyes that judge. Freaks her out, terrifies her, they point at her, they confront her, she backs away, takes refuge in the shell, which of course rolls over the side. So these are the false destinies, the ideas of being a party girl, being a debutante, being a young, frivolous girl. They're not right for her. So she escapes the judgment of others, and that moves into the second section, which deals with flight, a second encounter with Kronos, and the dance of the dandelion blossom. And I think it's really important to remember, Dali was working with ballet at this point. He'd done a number of ballets in New York City where he did the decor. Ballet was on his mind. And so we have the song Destino. He's trying to find a dance for it. And so there's two dances that happen in the movie. So she falls curiously naked, but we just go with that. And suddenly she hits and finds these telephones that have spider legs to them, and she jumps down and runs into the landscape. And then we're back at the obelisk with Kronos. And in the background, there's this lovely tower that casts this very long shadow. She's wandering along somewhat aimlessly, And she suddenly discovers, using the same image we saw a little bit ago, the same face of her, she looks down, and she discovers the shadow of the bell tower looks very much like a person. So if you can look at this, it's almost like there's a head, two outstretched arms, and the bell shape is the skirt. She walks over, lines herself with it, and suddenly she becomes the shape of the sequence of the bell tower. She is the bell tower. She's the girl skipping rope. She pulls herself out of the shadow, and suddenly she's dancing in the landscape. And so she's both the girl resembling the bell tower, and she's free. She's basically, by removing herself from the frivolous fantasies of the world, she's become somewhat more pure. And this allows her to then perform the dance of the dandelion blossom, where she transforms into a dandelion, and the dandelions blow away, which makes the transition into the next section, section 3, which is biological clocks and barriers. So the biological clock, pretty easy to understand because we've got Kronos, the god of time, who basically is able to break free from the obelisk because of the power of her dance. And in pursuing her, we suddenly have this kind of, this bird come over and tap on the watch on his wrist, which is the idea of the biological clock, which suddenly leads to him looking at his hand, and ants start crawling out of his hand, which immediately transform into bicycle riders with these loaves of bread. It is one of the most pure Dalinian moments in this not so straightforward story already, but it's pure transformation. It's just absolutely engaging and fun. He's confused by it for some reason, and he sees like another one of these dandelion blossoms pass by, which becomes the ballerina. And suddenly they find themselves caught in the surreal maze, this labyrinth of life. And they're wanting to come together. They're immediately ready to be attracted to each other and run to each other. And the sands of time start to spill out. And so suddenly all these walls come up between them until finally they're on two different plateaus. She's lower, he's higher. They're separated by this wall. But it does not deter the young Dahlia, who then reaches up her arms and releases all of these birds, which lead us to the next section. Section 4, the maze of relics, and Destiny shows the way. She releases the birds, which fly over the wall, come down, swoop past Kronos, and lead to creating the really most amazing moment in the film, which is this incredible face of Destiny, the god Jupiter, which we've recreated upstairs in the gallery as an archway. I read someplace, and I'm not quite sure that I was reading it clearly, but it sounded like this face of Jupiter was actually recommended or suggested by Walt Disney, that it was Walt's suggestion that led to this being one of the featured details in the movie. And we have one of the beautiful finished backgrounds for it that Dali painted. But of course, in the archway, suddenly Dahlia comes walking out, the bird flies by, we suddenly see a caterpillar on a bush, they come together, and then finally, there's the face of Destiny, Jupiter, controlling the fate of the two figures, and it allows him to pass through the space. So apparently there was blockage there. The presence of Dahlia and the birds leads to Destiny allowing them to come together again. Part 5, the baseball ballet. This was definitely Dali's late contribution to it, but it's very memorable. Kronos suddenly becomes a baseball player. His face aligns with the detail of Destiny that he passed through, and then suddenly he's a baseball player in front of this open plain, and this is the creepiest moment of the entire movie, where we suddenly have the two turtles. And we got these two turtles with these huge heads, very clearly both modeled on Dali as faces, but much more grotesque than any Dali face. They're moving slowly across the plain, and there's a baseball hovering in the background, baseball players looking at it. They're coming closer together, and then finally, they come together. The negative space becomes the ballerina. So Dahlia is suddenly released, and she dances forth. And it's based on kind of the classic positive-negative space illusion of the hidden face and goblet. And suddenly her head is the baseball. She throws the baseball to Kronos, smacks it very hard, and that leads us to the finale of the show, which is the Temple of Love and Kronos' journey from lust to love. And I'm using, there's a particular gentleman, it's referenced earlier, Ron, I want to say Balinglia, but I know that's incorrect, who had written kind of an exposition online of these sections, and it rhymed really well with Dali's own description of the film. So that's where a lot of these ideas are coming from. But suddenly the baseball representing her is now going through this very long described as a Busby-Berkeley kind of tunnel, the sort of hypnotic patterning of all these telephones, only to arrive at the catcher's mitt, which immediately transforms into kind of a cellophane heart in the middle of the Temple of Love, this architectural structure. He reaches around, grabs it, it becomes the body of Dahlia, and then finally collapses into a small pocket, which he pushes into his heart. And the very last sequence once again returns to the obelisk, Kronos, and the camera goes very, very close right to his heart, and suddenly you realize that she has become part of him. So the bell tower with the dandelion blossoms are coming out of the opening in his heart. So, that's the story. That is a very, very long, arduous sort of task to figure them all out. There's a lot of stuff, and it's not clear. I don't think anybody would ever have been able to tell me that there were 6 sections and that this is what each of them were. But that's the story of this love affair that Dali wanted to bring about. Unfortunately, even though a lot of those ideas were very, very well developed and they were pretty far along, it's been taking a long time. It's been almost a year that this project, this 7-minute project, has been going forward. And so there were some distant differences between Walt and Salvador. And Walt comes to visit the studio one day to see what was happening, and suddenly he's told about this whole baseball section. Never part of the original discussion, kind of freaked Walt Disney out, and basically he quietly he pulled the plug. He felt that $70,000 had been invested in it, and we're talking about baseball players. So he walked away. He basically said, let's shut this down. There were a lot of problems for Disney Studios at this point, 1946 to 48. One of them was that the RKO distributor was putting a whole lot of pressure on Disney to not release any more Fantasias. They wanted something like Sleeping Beauty. They wanted Pinocchio. They wanted something that was a feature-length film. They did not want another package film. They didn't do well in the market. So he was already at battle on that. And of course, the Destino would have been part of a package film. Also, there was no European market at the time. All the cinemas collapsed. There was no money in Europe. And this was a big part of, Disney Industries, and money came from Europe. So that was a big problem. And all of this was forcing layoffs. One of the gentlemen who worked with Hench and Dali, Bill McCormick, was one of the key figures that was laid off. If there was no work, there was no job. And so a lot of Disney animators had to walk. So it was a very hard time for Disney Studios. And as I said, for Walt, he had already invested $70,000, which would have been a lot of money at that time. And from his perspective, there was still no finished film. And it's been pointed out by many people outside that if you were true to Dali's script, it would probably be more like an 18-minute movie, not a 7-minute movie. So Dali was never good about containing his ideas. They seemed to spill all over the place. So perhaps rightly, Disney decided this is just a project that we're not going to see through to the end. John Hench thought maybe if Disney saw a little segment of this animated, maybe he'd change his mind. And so Hench oversaw a 16-second segment being produced, which is showing up in the gallery right now. And essentially you see the 2 turtles come across and create the ballerina inside of the negative space. Walt saw it. He was very intrigued by it, but it did not persuade him to see it through to the end. So it was put on the shelves and basically abandoned. Dali contacted Hench a year later, said, what's the possibility? And that's when he found out that Disney was laying off a lot of people. So it was kind of abandoned as an idea. Just unfortunately wasn't able to come to fruition. Jump forward to 2002, 2003, Dali Centennial was coming up. Roy Disney had been fascinated with it since the mid-1990s when it was used in a second Fantasia, Fantasia 2000, and he always wanted to do something with it. They started looking at the original contract, and it was actually said that if the film was never made, the artist owned all of the artwork that was produced for it. Otherwise, it belongs to Disney Studios. Gave him an idea that this was the time was right. If they didn't make the film, they would lose all this Dali artwork. And so he took it overseas because, of course, Eisner was not very predisposed to spending lots of Disney money at that time. So he took it overseas very quietly, and he went to Dominic Monfray, who was a director, and Baker Bloodsworth, the producer, and basically had them do it at Paris Disney Studios. So they completed the project, which is what we're showing in the theater 3 times every hour. And what's really wonderful is John Hench was amazingly still alive. So almost 50 years later, he was still alive. He was 95. he was able to be there for the discussions about what they wanted Destino to look like. He wasn't a major contributor, but he was able to explain some of the complicated storyboards. And so a lot of the ideas are very much retained in the final product, and it was because of John Hench's influence. So even though Walt Disney and Salvador Dali weren't able to see the completion of the film, one of the very important figures, John Hench, was able to see it through to its completion. And 58 years later, in 2004, it was nominated for an Academy Award. For those of you who saw David Bosseret, who was here, one of Disney animators, basically felt the award was stolen from them, and that's another story that I'm not going to get into, but it is a pretty wonderful little film. So the last things to say before we conclude, there are 2 more sections to the exhibition. They're very short, but thinking about all that went into this and all the complexity, you would imagine that Dali and Disney would part their separate ways and that would be the end of the story. But actually, that's definitely not true. The first observation to make is that there's a lot of Disney animators who remembered the time that Dali was there and were very much open to surrealism. And so there's a lot of surrealist influence that actually comes through Disney Studios long after the project is abandoned. One of the most wonderful kind of rhyming back and forth projects is Disney artists trying to talk about mathematics in the movie Donald and Mathmagic Land. And I remembered seeing this as a child. I'm sure a number of you saw it on The Wonderful World of Disney. And if you haven't seen it, you probably have heard about it because now it's something we feature all the time during Pi Day in March. But it really seems like Disney artists were talking with Dali about how to approach these mathematical concepts of the Fibonacci sequence, the golden ratio, all these ways that you can find math in nature. And that's exactly what Dali went on to. He moved from surrealism into what he called nuclear mysticism, exploring mathematics in paintings like Nature More Vivant. So we have some wonderful selections of some of the artwork behind Donald and Mathmagic Land. And the final section of the show deals with the fact that there was a friendship that started in 1945 and continued up through the 1960s. And when you look at it on the left-hand side, 1951, Dali and Gala visit Walt Disney in California, and they get to ride on the Lily Bell on the Carolwood Pacific. Here's Dali, ever so dignified, with his walking cane, riding the train. Very crazy. And then 6 years later, 1957, Walt Disney and his wife Lillian wind up visiting Dali in Port Legat and have a great time. At least judging from the photographs, they seem to really be enjoying themselves. Walt is suddenly exposed to Dali's universe, Dali's ideas. They have a wonderful dinner, and it's kind of warm friendship. And what comes out of this is a discussion of a project that was never acted upon, but was very much a real project of doing something about Don Quixote. So not only did the friendship continue, but even the possibility, despite the problems of Destino, there was still this talk about, well, maybe we can do another one. And it never happened, but certainly Disney pursued Don Quixote, and there's a number of studies from their studios that have been shelved, never completed, but definitely worked on. And then Dali illustrated a copy of Don Quixote. And finally, the last thing is in 1961, Walt invites Salvador to contribute some artwork to a ball to raise money for the place where Disney trains their artists and invites basically creates classes for them to study animation. It's called the Shinar Institute, and this was called the Bal Shinar. And you can see the wonderful piece that Dali had contributed, which is this figure holding these kind of metamorphic butterflies on this walking stick. So very light, very frivolous, very fun, definitely dealing with metamorphosis, and it seems to have been given freely by Dali for this particular project. So even in 1961, Dali's still thinking very kindly of Disney and reciprocating back and forth. And the very last moment of our exhibition, which is unique and definitely nothing like what happened in California, we had what I keep describing as 2 trains leaving the station independently, and eventually they realize they can arrive together. One of our board members, Jeff Goodby, is with the company Goodby, Silverstein and Partners. They had approached us, or at least talked about a collaboration with us back when we did the Illusion exhibition, of something related to a kind of 3-dimensional virtual reality experience of one of the paintings. And this project was already happening kind of simultaneously with Disney, but never discussed as being part of the same project. And as the project started getting closer and closer together, it really became clear that not only would these be really cool to put together, but they had to be put together because what we were talking about with the virtual reality experience was an experience of a Dalían architectural painting where you walk into the architecture and explore it through the most modern technology, which is very much what Disney would have done. And of course, from animatronics all the way down, Disney was always about the modern and most recent technology. And it also rhymes perfectly with this idea of architecture and the imagination. And with that, I am going to conclude and invite those of you who haven't seen the show, please go up, spend some time. There's about 45 minutes of audio with Sigourney Weaver, which is delightful. There's 17 monitors worth of visuals to take in, so it's about an hour's worth of film. It's a slow, wondrous kind of show to constantly reveal new things. Hopefully this whetted your appetite. Thank you all for coming this morning.